Hello. I want to talk about complexitism again. I think it was back in 2016 that I first introduced this topic in the video Introduction to Complexitism. And I want to bring it up again because it's one of the things that occasionally sort of floats around here on the channel and in my head. Now, complexitism, just as a brief reminder, is a general view on progress and the progress of societies and of people and of reality, and just a general theory of the good at that. And this general theory of progress ties progress to the concept of complexity, and that more complexity is more progress. The more complexity that the system gains is better. Now, I'm bringing up the left and the right because I've had a bit of a different interpretation of the left and right recently, and the whole political spectrum thing. And I think that the way that these two things, the way that the two sides sort of work is different with regards to complexitism than how I originally formulated it. See, what I said back in that video was that complexitism is essentially a left-wing idea. That's what I said. It's essentially like, politically it ties to the left. It leans to the left, not to the right. And I'm having to take that back now because I realize there are actually things on the left that are very much complexity reducing, and there are things on the right that are very much complexity, non-reducing. And in fact, the left and the right in general are sort of, they're not really, they're not as diametrically opposed as people might think. There are elements of both sides that intimately depend on one another. They depend on each other, in fact. It's sort of like, you can't really have the left without the right. That's what I'm trying to say. And I feel like people don't realize that. I feel like conventional debate is so dull at this point, and so kind of like misguided, where people aren't really even trying to identify things that they can agree on and things that they can sort of move forward with, and are just obsessed with looking for symbols of things about things they disagree with. For example, Twitter has partly contributed to this. Thanks, Twitter. Fuck you. I was just recently read a tweet where someone said, something like along the lines of, I don't trust anyone who doesn't hate capitalism. Hate is a strong word, at least if you ask me. There are people who don't hate capitalism that I would trust simply because I've met them and they've been great people to me, so that already doesn't fit my experience of it. It ends up being this weird thing where the left has essentially... I know that I'm sort of a leftist, at least I have been historically on the channel. I have to renounce that identifier at this point, by the way. I have to sort of say, no, I'm not really a leftist, although a lot of my nominal positions are what would typically be considered left-leaning. But I'm not really a leftist. I'm not a rightist either. I'm sort of anti-politics. Not apolitical, anti-political, which means being both anti-leftist and anti-rightist at this point. That's how I describe it right now. The problem with what the left has done is they've essentially just attached capitalism, the word capitalism, to just unfairness. Just the concept of unfairness and people being treated unfairly, and that's it. And, it's like, you say you hate capitalism, it's like saying you hate unfairness, and it becomes the exact same thing as that. Meanwhile, people on the right have done the exact opposite, where they've just attached capitalism to, they've attached so much informational baggage to capitalism that it now resembles pretty much every single thing in society that, is sort of inherently tied to the mechanics of how things work that you can't really oppose it. So it's different than, say, opposing feudalism, right? It's like you can oppose feudalism because you can say, well, we don't need to have a king, but you can't oppose having an administrator because we haven't gotten rid of that. That still exists, right? So if you were around in feudal times and you were saying, well, we shouldn't have administrators, you would be a fool, right? Even if that's somehow possible at the time, probably wasn't possible just because there's no... The information wasn't there for how to make society work without administrators at all. You could get rid of kings, you couldn't get rid of administrators. And if you were making the latter argument, that argument would be completely ineffective and pointless. And that's sort of how it works here as well. It's like you can... it's a question of what can you actually get rid of and what can't you get rid of. Certain things that we can get rid of that people don't even realize. There's what we can get rid of is austerity politics, and what we can get rid of is this idea that printing money is somehow tied to, like, fundamentally tied to inflation. You can have, positive money, modern monetary theory. That's something that we can introduce, but it's not very popular. You have things like that right there, where people on the left and the right generally, the academics generally agree on those issues, but the people who argue about this stuff on Twitter don't. So, it just becomes, for the most part, it turns into just a game of symbols. And I think the change that I've experienced is I've sort of understood more about what the right is really about over the past, year or so. They're very concerned with preserving certain things about individualism and individual freedom and stuff like that, to the point where, it isn't clear. The areas where there's disagreement, it isn't clear which option is actually the right option. It's not clear whether the left or right general approach makes sense. And I think the reason it isn't clear is because the ideologies are fundamentally flawed on their own. Tying this back to the whole complexitist idea, I think that the left and right divide itself is sort of it's sort of distorting, the whole political spectrum, and you got the four quadrants and that whole thing. It's that spectrum cannot possibly give you a sense as to what kind of societies we can have. It can't possibly give you that. At most, what it gives you is just a nominal sense of where you stand on certain issues. It does not give you a sense as to what society itself can look like. Because if you go further out into the extremes and you get further and further deeper down to the logic itself, the extremes become indistinguishable from one another. Right libertarianism becomes indistinguishable from left libertarianism, and libertarianism becomes indistinguishable from authoritarianism, because extreme liberty is just the state where everything is controlled by natural law, and the state of ultimate control is controlling everything through natural law, because that's the only way you can have ultimate control, right? And those two things are identical, right? So instead of being a 2D space, it's more of like a three-dimensional sphere, where the center is like the bottom of the sphere and every extreme is the top of the sphere. And it's all the same thing, indistinguishable from everything else. And this ties into an even deeper philosophical problem, which is that everything is just contradictory and everything is indistinguishable from everything else. And we're just stuck in this fucking, swamp of paradoxes. Unfortunately, the thing about that is that, well, that's just not good enough, obviously. There does need to be some kind of solution, and I think part of the solution is relaxing some of the assumptions that created the divide between the left and right in the first place. Relaxing some of the assumptions that we have about society in general that go into determining the way society should look. So for instance, imagining society as sort of, government versus market, that sort of model. That model is what's flawed, right? The use of the model is what's flawed, not the conclusions you can draw from the model. And that's actually an important point, right? Because, one of the criticisms that I've had towards libertarians over the years is that that model is flawed. You look at society, you cannot possibly say that society is government versus market. That's not how it works. That's not really fundamentally how it works. But that is how they perceive it, and that's why they get stuck, and that's why they get those conclusions about, market versus government. But the left has just as equally dropped the ball on this, because they'll look at that and say, well, I mean, some of them will say that some people will say that that model is flawed, but there's a difference between saying that the model is flawed and just taking the opposite side in the model, right? And I think sometimes the left forgets which one it's actually trying to do, right? Because you can say, look, you can say that the model is flawed and our understanding of the system needs to change, versus saying, well, no, you can't oppose the government. You should let the government, do this. The government should do this. The government should do that, right? Basically, it's saying that the model is flawed, but then using that as just an excuse to get the government to do certain things, right? Because that doesn't, at that point, you're not really rejecting the model. Not effectively, you aren't. You're still sort of working within the confines of it. And part of the problem is it's very difficult to come up with a new model. It's like coming up with a new kind of physics. We're stuck here with like, Galilean physics, or Galilean politics, and we're trying to get to Newtonian politics, and it's just not easy. And I'm thinking the complexitism is just one of the ways of doing that. It's about breaking down some of the assumptions, so that when we start analyzing the way society can work, the models we use are a bit more sophisticated and true to the nature of the system itself. Because if you look at, you look at leftist or conservatist theories, they're not true to the nature of the system itself. Not deep down. They're also much too concerned with the outcomes rather than the processes that are in play, right? And that's also an important aspect. Part of what we're doing, progressively, is we're just sort of trying to unearth which processes are actually in play, and then piggyback off of those processes. Because, so for example, you have David Sloan Wilson's work regarding group selection, right? It's like once we find out that group selection is actually a thing, and we're sort of more aware of it, we now know how to interpret certain behaviors and choices that we make within the system as part of a group selection mechanism. And that's actually the point, right? We're not fundamentally stripping something out of the system. We're reinterpreting the way the behavior of the system itself actually is, and that's what ends up changing it. So it's things like that. It's not about, say, like, let's get rid of companies, let's get rid of trade, let's get rid of markets and all that shit. So I can no longer, I have to retract what I said in Introduction to Complexitism, where I said that it's a left-wing thing. It's not a left-wing thing. It's both a left and a right thing, because both sides do fundamentally have something to offer, and there's sort of this like Hegelian synthesis of everything that's actually important. And one of the avenues for this is modern monetary theory. Of course, I've already mentioned that as something that needs to be explored. And it's really, you'd be very weird to call that a leftist theory or a conservative theory, right? It'd be very weird to call it either one. Right, it's certainly not a typical conservative theory, because it does sort of cement a role for the government, but it's not really a leftist theory either, because it's not calling for, communism or welfare or anything like that. It's just saying the government can print as much money as it wants until, insofar as the economy is producing things that money can buy. So long as there's more things in production, or there's the promise of more things being to be produced, more money can be printed. It has to stop printing money when there's too much, when there isn't enough stuff being produced, because that only then does it turn into inflation. I mean, that's just like a rough little snippet element of it. But yeah, there's this. And I think, you look at, I'm also, more interested in people like Hayek now, because some of their theories and ideas about, like, the role of information and stuff as well have sort of, I think they have something to offer insofar as describing what the system is like. I will say, though, that fundamentally there's no way to just, there's no way to not criticize capitalism. I guess, at least from my own perspective, I should say that I can't not criticize capitalism. It's like fundamentally in my nature to do that. But I don't trust when anybody else does it, because I don't know if they're doing it for the right reasons. I know the reason I'm doing it, and the reason I'm doing it is in the pursuit of excellence, right? Everything is to be in the pursuit of excellence, and that is something that, I don't trust the left necessarily that that's what they're all about. Some of them may not be interested in excellence very much. Right, and the pursuit of fairness should be tied to the pursuit of excellence fundamentally, if we're to try to optimize both of those things, right? And again, it becomes a game of complexity because you need a system that's more complex in order for more kinds of excellence to exist, and for collective excellence to, sort of be maximized. That the complexity sort of comes into this. I know a lot of it sounds just like verbiage right now, but that's because a lot of this stuff. A lot of these ideas have yet to be sort of diligently sort of dissected and displayed in a written form where every little piece can be broken down bit by bit. I have not done that yet. And because I have not done that yet, all I can talk about is through this, like, verbiage-y way of discussing this idea of complexity and what exactly that is and what that has to do with our progress as a species. So yeah. Yeah, there's that. There's one more thing I wanted to mention about the pursuit of excellence. I guess it just becomes... It becomes like the kind of game where if you have to sort of know what society can look like. You have to sort of be aware of the dynamics of the information to know how the kind of shape that this thing can even take before you start to figure out what it is that you can effectively begin to oppose. And I'm just getting so tired of people trying to take the moral high ground with their political position on this whole thing, which they're doing way too recklessly, and especially on the left, because if you go to any educated circle, any academic circle, that is essentially, that is the dominant ideology in play, and people will take the reckless position. They will recklessly seize the moral high ground so quickly because, well, they're pursuing fairness and they're pursuing niceness and goodness, and it's all that simple, right? No, it's not that simple. Fairness is not a simple concept, okay? You need to be very concerned with both the individual stakes in this and the collectivist stakes in it before you need to be concerned simultaneously with meritocracy, with meritocratic distribution of something, of merit, of value, as well as a collective collective effort that applies to everybody equally, because both those things are simultaneously in play. Right? And just as a little snippets, like one thing that I always attach to complexity as well is how art itself works. And I know that I'm jumping around right now, but I haven't actually gotten into that. But one thing that I get from pretty much everybody on the left and the right is just from general people is this maxim: art is subjective. you know, art is subjective, and you Anton, you're trying to, you know, impose your own standards on subjective things. They are not subjective things. Art is not subjective. That is like, if there's one thing that is so mainstreamified that just pisses me the hell off, it's when people say that. When people say that art is subjective, because it's not, and saying that it's subjective and acting like it's subjective is antithetical to art itself, and things that it's antithetical to the very point of art. Because when you say that it's subjective, it's like saying morality is subjective. You're setting a level playing field on everything and presuming objective values in the process, and thus neglecting things that ought to be considered above other things, which just, you get into that whole fucking mess. So, yeah, the general conclusion from this video, and I know I've meandered a little bit, is just the idea is the core of complexitism is not something that is fundamentally leftist. It is fundamentally anti-political. It's neither leftist nor rightist. It tries to hit it tries to cover all the ground, you know, both grounds, not just one camp. And that's all there is to say about that. Cheers.